With more than 100 participants, President Cyril Ramaphosa did not participate, and afterwards people streamed into the stadium. Some Mangaung residents demonstrated inside the stadium complaining about unemployment, and others were there to celebrate the day. Government says it will continue to honor the centenary year of Nelson Mandela.
Right, let's take the discussion a little bit further on Freedom Day, and we're now joined by Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective, Lebohang Pheko. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
All right, so it's Freedom Day, and one of the things that I did this morning, and I was curious because we kind of throw this word out, freedom, and there's so many different definitions: exemption from external control, interference, the power to determine action without restraint, political or national independence, the state of being free or at liberty rather than confinement from physical restraint. So that's what the dictionary says.
Tells us.
But we have a different understanding or feeling towards it. How do we navigate this word freedom on Freedom Day?
Yeah, very good question. So we need to decide for ourselves whether our aspiration was to be free or whether it was to be liberated. And freedom is a very loose term, and it can, as we were saying just now, it can mean whatever we want it to mean. You know, the freedom to associate, the freedom to vote, the freedom to education. And, you know, we've reduced the idea of freedom to almost as a proxy of access to things, material and social tangible things, access to maneuver, social and power relations, and we've reduced it to that. And yet it's so much more. Being free and saying that we're free people in an African country has to be so much different to being free in a country like the United Kingdom or Italy, or countries which have never been colonized, because they don't say these things from a perspective of ever having been subjugated and never ever having had external power subjugate them and restrict and constrict their ability to determine who they want to be as countries. So there's a massive difference between us and them, and the use of free or freedom in these contexts.
So what should we be doing in embracing freedom or trying to charter a course forward? So our country's president, what should he have said on Freedom Day to inspire freedom or liberation?
So just that last bit that you mentioned, are we striving for freedom, are we striving for liberation? So liberation, which seems to have a much broader and stronger currency in African context. Now, liberation speaks about self-determination. Liberation also talks about the ability to transform socioeconomic relations. It talks about the ability to also build indigenous, internal, intrinsic power, transform institutions and build institutions that really speak to an African imagination, and that we have not really been able to do. Adaptability is fine. I mean, I have no issue with that, but I do have an issue with an adaptability which is not discernibly different to what has been in the past, and which does not differentiate us as African people. And it would have been very useful for President Ramaphosa to give us a sense of that differentiation, because I think many people across this country have been, the young generation feel increasingly disinterested in the South African project as it has been expressed since 1994. They are completely unimpressed by Robben Island credentials and so forth, and by the idea that there are a few founding fathers and I suppose one or two founding mothers to whom we owe a form of freedom. They're interested in the substance of living, the substance of what it means to be a young person growing up in this country, accessing education, accessing economic opportunities, accessing the marketplace, accessing labor, and so on, and also accessing ideas. And liberation is not just it's not just about lowering one flag and raising another. It's also about our ability to recarve and reimagine who we want to be as a people. And I don't think that we have adequately done that. In my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many people, the rainbow just does not cut it as a popular imagination.
And I guess, if I'm unemployed, what it means is that I don't have the freedom to make certain choices. If my pay is so low, my freedom to choose or what to buy is also limited. So it does speak to actual, real, tangible choices that one can make if unemployment, inequality and poverty continue.
So, you know, and the whole question about being free to, you know, having access to education, you know, access to healthcare, access to and you know, to employment, you know, access to employment, which is often so poorly paid that it doesn't really give you the opportunity to transition from one social economic place to the next. Doesn't give you the ability to put aside some kind of a savings so that you can transition, if not yourself personally, but the next generation, your children, educationally and so on, to transition them from one place to the next. It doesn't even give you the opportunity to move geographically very widely. I mean, many people in this country, as we know, the statistics are fairly shocking, spend up to a third or more of their income just trying to get to and from work, and that's a terrible ratio. And then on the other hand, we speak about becoming a saving nation. We speak about places where there still is very little access to energy, to fuel, to electricity, so our days are shorter. Our ability to be productive is severely hampered, and not only productive in terms of the workplace, but productive in terms of your ability to move around and have a social life, engage in activities, in culture, in poetry, and in things that nourish you differently. So we often negate the idea that freedom is also to do with well-being. We have completely ignored the idea of the ability to have rest, to have leisure, the time to think and reflect, because these are the things. It is in the stillness where great ideas, great liberation, liberatory inspirations often emerge.
So, I mean, I remember 24 years ago, just down the road actually, Auckland Park Primary School, that's where I voted, and I had an opportunity to vote. And those that can remember that far back will know that it was a very different South Africa. And so the politicians rightly can say, we've come a long way, we've done a lot in 24 years. But I guess the real question is, where could we have been had we done all the right things compared to where we actually are? And that gap, what is it that's caused that gap from what our potential was to what we've actually been able to achieve?
So when you say, you know, we've come a long way, or it's said that we've come a long way, it's often reduced to the idea that the optics have changed. So schools are more racially integrated, the workplaces are more racially integrated. But that is the measure of our liberation, then I suppose by all means it's going well. But I think that if it's really not about the optics, but it's really about the substance of what liberation means and access to power, the economy, etc., it's a long way off, because this suggests then that this was a race relations, a civil rights struggle. This is not America, with all due respect. This was a liberation colonial struggle in common with any other. And I think that what confuses people about countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia is the proximity of European people and the volume, the relative volume and proximity that they are with us in our lives, in our daily lives. And yet this was really, if this were just about a race relations war, a race relations battle, really that would just be a civil rights question. This is an African country, and I think what we haven't been able to do is to translate the aspirations of liberation into an African imagination, and we keep on obscuring it. You know, people go to jail for using the bad words, people get upset inside Spur, and we get all on top of that, and yet that's really not the substance of what this that's really actually suggesting that indeed it was all about people, black and white people, sharing swimming pools and beaches and park benches. And I think it's an incredible insult to the people who fought valiantly, spent time in jail, spent time in exile. And I think it's a peculiarly South African construct, which is designed to actually distract us from the real business of the daily project of liberation.
You know, one of the things that I often notice on days like today is we don't see a lot of white people coming out to the stadia and celebrating Freedom
waving
Day.
Flags and
I just wonder, you know, is it still kind of a question of it's not our holiday?
Well,
it's the holiday for black people.
Well,
and yet, really, for a complete South Africa,
building.
it should be for everybody.
So this goes back to my previous point as to then who does this freedom belong to? I mean, for a lot of people, a lot of white people, April the 27th was a terrible day. It was the day that they decided to book their one-way tickets to Australia and Canada, and that's a fact. And I think many people, if they have not left geographically, have certainly left in terms of emotionally. There's very little attachment to this country. And there's also very little sense of a redress, a very little sense in how then this privilege that they still hold 24 years into so-called liberation or freedom, how then they're going to begin to make amends and make redress, some kind of a reparation for previous generations. And I think that it's an appalling argument to say we were not there. We were all there in different ways, whether as oppressors or as those who were oppressed. We remain there. And I think that it's an ongoing project that we have to excavate this country from the horrible, terrible 350-year legacy that it still resides in different dimensions.
Okay, Lebohang, we could chat for hours. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I want to thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
On this Freedom Liberation Day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, well, staying with the